This is Notes on Quotes. I'm Stephen Harrison. I'm a writer and lawyer who's written for the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Atlantic, and I currently write the Source Notes column for Slate about the internet's knowledge ecosystem. Since I was a kid, I've loved quotes, words of wisdom that have played a meaningful role in people's lives. Each episode, I'm asking an interesting guest to come on the show to talk about a quotation of their choosing. My guest today is Jeremy Burge. We're all familiar with emojis, those little smileys and pictures you send in text messages and your online communications. Well, Jeremy is both the founder and the chief emoji officer of Emojipedia, the online encyclopedia of emojis. He's also an emoji historian and the creator of World Emoji Day. National radio in Australia has described Jeremy as, quote, the emoji king. Jeremy, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Stephen. Good to be here. And I don't think I've heard that quote from the Australian radio, so I like you picked that up. That makes me sound maybe more impressive than I am.
Oh, well, it's on your Wikipedia page, so it must be true. But
it must be.
Hey, Jeremy, which quote are we chatting about today?
So the quote I have here is from Steve Jobs, and he said this in 2003. The quote is, "Most people make the mistake of thinking design is what it looks like. People think it's this veneer that the designers are handed a box and told, make it look good. But it's not just what it looks like and feels like. Design is how it works."
Great. And as you said, the quote comes from Steve Jobs, the well-known co-founder of Apple and just this all-around technology idol. The quote also comes from an interview that Steve Jobs gave with the New York Times back in 2003, and that interview was titled "The Guts of a New Machine." But Jeremy, I'm always curious, out of all the quotes you could have selected, why did you pick this one?
It did feel a bit trite coming on a podcast about quotes and sort of naming Steve Jobs. It feels like maybe it's just in sort of my world and the technology world. It just feels like it's sort of maybe the obvious choice or even the overused sort of choice that people look up to entrepreneurs and maybe give them too much credit from time to time for being geniuses when maybe they're just sort of right place, right time. But nonetheless, this quote to me is actually, I feel like, broader than what it's saying, that it's about design, but I think we all have sort of areas of our lives where we know what makes something successful, but it's not what the outside world thinks makes it successful. So I just thought it's sort of an interesting, broader topic. And personally, I'm interested in product design and what actually does make something work well. And this encapsulated all of that for me.
You mentioned that in your view, design is this sort of broader topic. Can you expand on that beyond this traditional idea of design?
There's, I guess, a few different trains of thought on how you define design, but at least when it comes to products, what you often find is at companies, and I don't think I realized this years ago, but often people that are sort of in charge of design at companies, they might be in charge of, say, graphic design, but often they're in charge of product design, and that just means making choices on what you do and don't include in a product, what the product actually is in the first place, and who's going to use it. So in a lot of ways, I think when we're talking, especially technology companies, but it could be applied to a lot of places, that design is really just a stand-in for saying the decision maker or who's deciding what this actually is.
Steve Jobs gives this example of the hypothetical designers being handed the box and saying, hey, make this look good. And Steve Jobs makes the point that that's not the way that design should actually take place. Do you think that sometimes design or designers are brought in too late into the process?
Absolutely. I think it's every company. I used to work in sort of consulting for universities in Australia mostly, and I guess these days you might call it product design, that they'd have an idea. They'd want to bring something to students and they'd say, oh, we want a way for students to sign up to receive notices about the free food we're giving out this week or whatever it is. They were often small sort of little jobs. And they'd have this overly cumbersome system involved of how they need to collect student details and all this. And at the end, they'd go, well, make it easy. Students, make it easy for them to sign up to this thing. But there'd be 300 requirements behind the form of what you need to include and what you don't. And I think that's the case for plenty of companies. Once you have lots of people involved in anything, it's often the designers or the people implementing it that are handed this turd to polish and make a way to make this actually work for people. And in reality, it's normally not that simple. Someone needed to make a better decision months, weeks, years ago to make that work.
So you mentioned that when one of your first consulting jobs, you were working, as I heard it, on a student record department. Was that kind of strict experience something that made you want to break apart and do something different with Emojipedia?
Yeah, a lot of it was about that I was working sort of advising companies on how to build things, and mostly they didn't listen. And not that I'm some kind of genius, but these were pretty simple things. There was often, I remember one project where a client wanted to grow their social media presence, and they're sort of saying, oh, we've got, a Facebook page. How do we get people to follow it? And look, anyone could tell you, like, oh, make it interesting, put interesting things up there, put photos up of what's happening, and put interesting news or whatnot. And nearly every company or department or whoever you worked for, what they wanted to put up there is what the vice chancellor of the university or the principal of a high school or the CEO of a company, they kind of want to have the blah blah from them that no one wants to read. So it was just sort of a frustrating experience. You go to them, look, this is so easy. I don't even know why you're paying me to tell you, put up interesting things online. So Emojipedia, to some degree, was sort of not quite a bet, but just something I did in my spare time to kind of go, well, here, look how easy this is to write interesting things online. And it could have been a big failure, but it turned out people actually did like it too.
Yeah, they absolutely have it. As I mentioned, it's probably the most popular site on the web for emoji reference and kind of the go-to source for emoji information.
30 million page views a month now. So it's, people are interested in emojis. They want to know, and it could have been any other project, but it turns out that you find something that the whole world uses and wants to know more about, and you write about it, and that can be something successful.
Like you said, there's that kind of world demand, but was there also something that kind of just resonated with you sort of intrinsically on emojis as a topic?
Yeah, I've always been fascinated by, I was going to say dumb things, but not necessarily. But this isn't the first time I've sort of built something like this, that I've built all kinds of other sites over the years that were focused on one topic that seemed very niche. And don't get me wrong, those were all incredibly unpopular. And that kind of makes me appreciate, I guess, that people come to Emojipedia, because other things I've sort of hyper documented in the past. I had a site that looked at sort of these widgets that were on the Mac that for a little while there, that you sort of had these weather widgets and different things you could put on there. I had a website about urinals and men's toilets where I'd cover some of the better and worse ones of those in the world. The bailiff on Judge Judy. I don't know whether you've ever, do you know Bird the bailiff on Judge Judy by chance?
Yes, I'm familiar. You created a site for him?
Yes, I had a site where, because I like what he does, that he sort of says nothing for most of the show. He stands there, does crosswords. If you see the camera angle sort of pan over his shoulder, you see him doing crosswords on his clipboard there. And I just love the nuance of what his Bird said. If he says something funny, he does the little quip every now and then. So I document some of when Bird does something funny or interesting. So emojis in some way weren't special. They were just another in a long line of things that I thought there was more to than meets the eye, and this was the first one that was commercially successful as well as interesting to me.
That's interesting that there were kind of, quote unquote, several failures, at least in the sense of not being commercially successful, that led up to this Emojipedia site, which is tremendously successful.
And some of it I didn't realize at the time. I thought I was going to make this as a one-off piece and just say, how about this? How about we document every emoji? We don't give you more than you need. We just have a picture, bit of a description about where it comes from or how it's used. And there's only so many of them. I hadn't even counted them at the time. I was just literally building the site as we went. And then it was only years later where I realized that's when there are actually tougher decisions to make on how you represent how an emoji looks on every platform, and culturally, if they're used differently in different countries, what's the right balance between having this long, boring article about everything, or how do you pick and choose what's most notable to include? So it's sort of a year or two in became a much bigger project than just this one-off thing that I was trying to build.
Well, on that point about culture, I went to China last year and with some friends, that was the first time I had used WeChat, and they have sort of entirely different emojis over there. The representation of people and emotions and emojis is entirely different. Do you think that the emoji design itself can influence a culture?
I do. I'm actually super fascinated by this sort of online monoculture that we have. As someone that's grown up in Australia, lived in the UK, travels to the US a lot, I feel like there's sort of this, for want of a better word, Western monoculture online where you kind of have the same sort of memes and the same ideas, and what's available, such as what an emoji looks like, can shape culture and shape how we look at things. And you do get something like the peach emoji being used as a butt becomes a universal thing, even though it doesn't look that much like a butt, right? It's just something that people do and it spreads. So yeah, I think that it is interesting that specifically the power some companies, mainly Apple, but Google as well, and Samsung, how they design an emoji can influence sort of a culture and how people are communicating.
Apple and others were criticized in the earlier days of emojis for not having enough racial diversity. That's changed in more recent releases. What trends do you see similar to that in the future to kind of make a more inclusive emoji environment?
So the first emoji set sort of came from Japan, and some of them didn't even really have humans, or some of them, all the initial sort of faces were red or these sort of bright shades. And then unfortunately, what sort of happened is there were only a few people in some of those early sets, but they were white. Apple sort of took cues from the companies they'd worked with in Japan, so they brought them across and they were still white. As you said, there's sort of racial diversity got added, and then gender diversity was another sort of sticking point for a while there, where there was only one person who was a runner or a police officer, and often they were depicted as men if they were doing sort of an active role. And now we're looking at, when it comes to inclusivity, there's more push to have accessibility, people in wheelchairs or with canes. And then we've sort of got this gender inclusive, gender ambiguous push. It's almost a push back from adding the choices to pick a man or a woman on a lot of these, and people are sort of saying, well, maybe I just want to reference a doctor in general, and I don't want to say whether it was a man or a woman. Shouldn't there be some kind of way to represent that in a gender ambiguous way? So I think that's definitely where it's heading at the moment.
That's interesting. So just to summarize, you're saying that the shift was maybe to have those kind of different versions, and now it's maybe going to maybe a more...
Yeah, I think the challenge is you get the sort of... Everything has two sides to it when it comes to gender in particular is tricky to implement, because on the one hand, you could take a purist argument and say, look, why should an emoji have gender at all? That's a thing, people sort of sometimes say the same about skin tone. Why should emojis have skin tone? Shouldn't they just be little yellow people? When it comes to skin tone, if it looks like a person, then yellow sort of becomes a proxy for white. And therefore, if you have, for instance, a black family, it looks nothing like the little yellow family, even though the yellow is not meant to be white. When it comes to gender, it's tricky because it's sort of like emojis can't fix society, right? And often, at least in studies that have been done, when you show a sort of gender ambiguous person, people just assume it's a man. So if you took gender out of emoji altogether a few years ago and said, look, instead of having men and women doing different roles, we'll just make them all sort of gender ambiguous, a lot of the world, rightly or wrongly, would look at that and just think, oh, they all look like men now. So you kind of do need the man, the woman, and the gender inclusive option to make the point that this one is the one that is the middle ground.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm interested in this idea of some of our political and cultural battles spilling over into the emoji space. One example that I've heard, on the more serious note, was related to guns, whether there should be a gun emoji, and now I think it's currently a water gun emoji option. There's also this on a more humorous front that in Texas, there was a motion on the Texas state legislature, the state of Texas here in the United States, to have and forbid people from using the Chilean flag as a proxy for the Texas state flag, because it's very close, but not quite the same.
So flags are an absolute minefield. I mean, the challenge with emoji is part of it, the way they're approved, the idea of adding an emoji is that it will be popular and well used, but often people wanting an emoji, they're not wanting it to be well used. That's sort of a side effect. They want it because being on a limited emoji keyboard that's on every phone in the world is a sign of prestige. And it sort of says you've made it. Yes, you could send a picture of the Texas flag all day long. It's easy to send anything as a picture these days, but having it as an emoji sort of carries some weight, like, oh, this is now on every phone in the world. So as you said, flags, no matter what, there's so many. Emojipedia itself doesn't approve new emojis. That's done by a non-profit consortium. But nonetheless, Emojipedia's inbox is full of emoji requests, and flags are always very, very high up there. this year, Unicode, which is the body behind sort of approving new emojis, has added a transgender flag as a draft candidate for next year. And that sort of thing, that's dragged on for a few years now of, is this notable enough as a flag? Is it different? Does it address something that the existing rainbow or LGBT flag doesn't? And there's no way to abstract emoji additions and approvals and designs from the rest of the world.
So with Emojipedia, you sort of designed this product, this reference website, in the Steve Jobs sort of way. Can you talk about sort of your role in the ecosystem of emoji development?
So the Unicode Consortium is a non-profit body, and they are involved in the approving of every text character in the world, not just emojis. They're more seriously, they cover sort of Mongolian scripts and all the Chinese scripts and Russian. And the fact that our computers started with Latin characters meant that English was already there sort of from the beginning of the personal computer, but all the other languages had to have different ways to catch up. And Unicode has different members that companies like Apple and Google and Microsoft, they're all Unicode members, but Emojipedia is a member as well. So we do get half a vote towards any new emoji. So yes, we alone, some people I think mistake it thinking, oh, Emojipedia can approve an emoji, but I'm involved. I've been previously the vice chair of the emoji subcommittee at Unicode, and I'm still a member of the committee that looks at new emoji proposals. So I do see them come through, and I do get to give my input. And eventually, if it came down to the crunch, Emojipedia could also cast its half vote at a Unicode meeting.
Half vote out of how many? Is it 5 or 10 or 12 or? Yeah.
I don't know the total number of companies that have a vote. I think it's around 20, but in an average meeting, maybe you've sort of got about 10 people in there who might have voting power, sort of representing a voting company. So Emojipedia has never had to cast its vote. Unicode prefers to do things by consensus, where all the companies agree, yes, these are the emojis we want to support. And if there's not effectively universal or near universal support, it won't get added rather than go down to a vote. But it could happen. You never know.
Can you describe those emoji or those Unicode meetings? Is it sort of like back of the bar, everyone's having cocktails and things like that? Or is it more formal?
It's very dry. It is a technical committee meeting, the main one. So the emoji subcommittee is sort of pre-vetting just proposals coming in, kind of like the admin department, just checking that all the boxes are filled. But then the technical committee, which is what I represent Emojipedia on, that's the one that actually makes the decisions. And honestly, the main focus is on sort of dry aspects of how does something like this scale? Flags in particular, we mentioned before. How does, if you add a new type of flag that doesn't yet exist, how does that scale to other flags if you want to add others? Maybe a more, I say an easier example. This year, there's been a sort of a long-held push, I think with a PR campaign from a wine company behind it for a white wine emoji. And sort of a discussion about that wouldn't so much be, do we like white wine? Is white wine something we want to put on the keyboard? It's more on the merits of, would it be popular? But more to the point, there's already an emoji called wine glass, which happens to have red wine in it. If you add a white wine emoji, are you retroactively saying that existing emoji has to be now red wine? Whereas right now, it's only called a wine glass emoji and it happens to be red. And you get these nuances that take over the discussion over any kind of broader picture. It's really about, is adding this going to be problematic in any way?
What you're saying is that adding the white wine glass could sort of change the meaning of the existing wine glass by turning it into a red wine glass. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, it's sort of it's almost beyond. It seems like a parody to discuss it externally, but it does make a difference. You've got a technical standard. It can't change very easily. You add an emoji and it sticks around forever. And the fact is, there's an emoji right now called wine glass. If you add an emoji called white wine, you're effectively redefining the existing one to say, well, that one has to be red wine now because it wouldn't make sense. Or do you add two more ones? Do you empty the wine glass because it's called wine glass and have an empty glass and a red and a white? And what does that mean for every other food group? Should they now have multiple options? So it's always about what's next then if we do this.
You said the white wine glass in particular was being pushed by a company, and you don't have to reveal that company or anything like that, but there's a certain degree of lobbying that goes on in the Unicode meetings.
I don't know whether it's lobbying. I don't think there's lobbying at the Unicode level, but definitely the proposal process is open. Anyone could submit a proposal and companies aren't banned from doing so. So I get it. If I'm a company and it's free to submit a proposal and I can get some publicity for it, even if it doesn't get approved, you can see why I know people, friends that have worked in communication sort of say that these days, every campaign meeting they sit around, the first idea in the room is, how do we get an emoji? We want the campaign. And then the first idea that anyone has is, how about we get an emoji for this campaign? So I get it. I get why companies want representation, because they get a free pass either way. Either they get some publicity over it or they get an emoji. So it's win-win for them.
Jeremy, the quote again is, most people make the mistake of thinking design is what it looks like. People think it's this veneer that the designers are handed this box and told, make it look good. That's not what we think design is. It's not just what it looks and feels like. Design is how it works. Steve Jobs. Jeremy, I was thinking I would ask you a little bit about the design of Emojipedia because I was experimenting with it beforehand. It's a really simple interface. I kind of like the idea that it's just very easy to navigate and sort by the most popular emojis. And you can actually search not just with text, wine glass. You could actually insert, if you're on your phone, the wine glass and search by the emoji itself. What were some of the design principles you put in place when you were putting together Emojipedia?
Honestly, I think the idea was to get the content out there first. I think a lot of the most popular websites, people don't care what they look like. Google was ugly to begin with. It's still pretty bare bones. Wikipedia, one of the most popular website in the world, or one of the most popular websites in the world, pretty ugly. Reddit, a very popular website, also quite ugly. You sort of get these sites, and I genuinely think that when it comes to the web in particular, people like beautiful objects in their lives. I understand that. But when it comes to content on the web, I think people want to get to it. They don't want to be bombarded with things popping up in their face. And, when you get to these clever websites and you scroll them, but instead of scrolling, things float in and float out and you can't find where you are anymore. So honestly, there's very little design in Emojipedia. It's just, how do we get the content here in a way that's legible and people can get around? And in some ways, kind of, I like the idea of being understated. I thought I was a bit concerned in the early days that someone else might sort of see it being moderately successful and try and just do exactly the same thing and be more successful at it. So I kind of wanted to fly under the radar. So when we were starting to get millions of visits a month, I liked the fact that you went to it and just kind of went, oh yeah, whatevs. That looks easy. That looks like no big deal. It's just a site about emojis. So, and we've sort of stuck around with it because why change it if it's working?
That makes a lot of sense. It actually probably does go to the Steve Jobs point about design being more about how the product works and not just a simple matter of veneer.
Right. It's got to work. You got to get there. And if you're not thinking about it, that's great. If you go there and you went, oh yeah, I looked up, if you think it's just the simplest thing in the world, I just went to Emojipedia and I looked up some information about an emoji, that's great. I don't want people to comment on how nice it looks or how clever it is. I want them to think it's the simplest website in the world, that we've got heaps of data in the background, extra tags on the emojis so that when you do search results, for instance, we don't sort of sort things by if you have alternative meanings, but if you type something like phallic into Emojipedia, you'll get a bunch of phallic emojis, but we can't have a category for that because schools use it nonstop. So there's all kinds of things built in there that are maybe a bit clever, but you just don't, they're not on the veneer. You just hope that you use it, you get what you want, and you get on with your day. And then we're happy, you're happy, that everyone's a winner.
Jeremy, you have on the Emojipedia site the different platforms with emoji. There's Apple and Discord, Facebook, Mozilla, Microsoft. One thing I'm thinking about in terms of design principles is how products can be designed, and then there's also different platforms that, while they speak to each other, they're also separate. How do you think about the idea of platforms, maybe in the context of emojis specifically?
Emojis are fun because they do actually give a platform some personality. I think in recent years, companies have veered away from personality in their products to some degree. They want to be shiny and fancy looking. Two things that emoji does. One, it makes companies make uncomfortable political declarations or decisions. Things like the gun emoji turning into a water pistol or a water gun. That's something a company doesn't want to make a statement on necessarily, but they have to if they have to choose how to represent this character. But also, what kind of character you give your emoji set. Apple's is super detailed and glossy and high resolution. Microsoft have these really iconic sort of styles that on the one hand look very nice and they fit in a lot on Windows, but on the other hand, they don't make me feel things. I see them and I kind of look at them like they're icons and I go, well, that's a pleasant looking face that does that, but it doesn't make me feel that emotion. So I think they're an interesting outlet for a company that they actually have to represent the company values and look good on the platform at the same time. And it's only been the last few years, I think the companies have really realized that. I think before then, they just thought it was some feature they had to include.
That's an interesting point because, going back to Steve Jobs, I think he definitely wanted Apple to have a personality, and that's arguably been why that company has been so successful. But maybe from a corporate standpoint or a corporate executive standpoint, that, as you said, that these are certain cultural or flashpoints that they might not necessarily want to weigh in on, and Emoji forces them to do so.
Yeah, companies hate having personality. They think they want personality, but they want some kind of boardroom personality where everyone agrees that this is inoffensive, and that's not what makes a personality, right? We like our friends, or we like people that we do because they have interesting quirks about them and things that don't always make sense, but you kind of get that makes them who they are. And I think more and more we find companies, understandably, they're multi-billion-dollar companies. They're sort of scared of having too much personality. Apple used to have more personality when Steve Jobs sort of felt like it was his personal vehicle, for better or worse. And how companies act today, they have to choose how to represent all these emojis in a way that, is going to look good to them, but also maybe actually have personality, which, whether they like it or not.
Well, speaking of personality, we could talk about Steve Jobs' personality for a bit. I read Walter Isaacson's biography of Jobs, and he talks a lot about there was good Steve and bad Steve, in the sense of him being incredibly creative, incredibly passionate, but as a manager, he was very often kind of a jerk. What do you think about this? Just since you picked a Steve Jobs quote, is he in some ways, or maybe not in other ways, a role model for you?
No, I don't think most people that are CEOs or politicians are role models for me. I feel like people in positions of power often do get there because they do have sort of a bit of a jerk in them somewhere. And I like people who are pretty nice and funny and friendly and empathetic. So I think Steve Jobs was an excellent product manager. I think it's very hard to replace a person that can have strong opinions and enforce them throughout new products that are successful. I think it was excellent at that, but no doubt it probably was awful to work for. And I'm always a bit wary of sort of looking up too closely to people in positions of power because so many of them have got there through being ruthless and maybe not acting how we'd actually like our friends to act. So I think it's important to separate what you appreciate is a value that someone has. And Steve Jobs had very good ideas around vision and products, I think, but in their personal life, I don't think you have to opt in and think they're a great role model for humanity. No way.
Well, of course, Jobs has this wise and insightful quote, notwithstanding the fact that he might not be the nicest person to work with. I was talking to some people before. You kind of have this reputation, kind of within the online community and within journalists of being very approachable, very friendly guy. And you selected the title Chief Emoji Officer for Emojipedia rather than Chief Executive Officer. I take it that was in some ways intentional.
Yeah, I think it's a bit fun. It is a fun job. It would be ridiculous to be in charge of a company that deals with emojis and didn't think of it as at least slightly amusing or slightly interesting. Yes, I take it seriously. Yes, we committed to actually having the right facts and to documenting and archiving these. But in reality, I just think there's a bit too much self-importance from the tech sector sometimes, and there's plenty of other better people in the world than those running tech companies. So I didn't want to be held up as any kind of someone really trying to show off my position, because in reality, I'm a guy who runs a company about emojis. So why not make it a bit fun?
Why not? Jeremy, thank you so much for coming on the show. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Hey, me too. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Notes on Quotes. Again, I'm Stephen Harrison, and this series is a team effort with audio production by Jason Cady. Our transcriptions are done by Sarah Baum of Sharp Copy Transcription. Our theme song is Water and Bridges by Joshua Heffernan. And our podcast cover art was done by Jacqueline Parsons. Check out our website, notesonquotes.com, where you can get the print versions of all of these interviews. Subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you choose, and please leave us a review. Don't forget to follow us on social media and Instagram, where our handle is Notes on Quotes. Thanks again.